Good evening, and welcome to Footnotes Folly. I am Professor Reginald St. John Pemberton, and tonight we begin a new and tremendous work, The Wars of the Jews, by Flavius. Josephus, a Jewish priest and general who fought in the Great War against Rome, was captured, and lived to write its history from the inside. We give it complete, in plain modern English, from the first line, nothing left out, in William Whiston's grand old public domain translation. The plain rendering, and the muttering, are my own. This is part 1. Before the war itself, Josephus rolls the clock back 2 centuries to explain how it all began: the revolt of the Maccabees against the Greek kings, the rise of the priestly Hasmonean house to a throne of its own, and the fierce, bloody reign of Alexander Janneus. Let us begin.
While Antiochus, called Epiphanes, was disputing with the sixth Ptolemy over the right to rule all Syria, a serious uprising broke out among the powerful men in Judea. They struggled with one another for control of the government, because each man of rank could not bear to be under the authority of another who was his equal. Onias, one of the high priests, gained the advantage and drove the sons of Tobias out of the city. They fled to Antiochus and begged him to use them as guides and make an expedition into Judea. The king was already inclined to do this, so he agreed. He came against the Jews with a large army, took their city by force, killed a great number of those who favored Ptolemy, and sent his soldiers out to plunder them without mercy. He also robbed the temple and stopped the regular daily sacrifice of expiation for 3 years and 6 months. But Onias the high priest fled to Ptolemy and received from him a place in the Nomus of Heliopolis, where he built a city like Jerusalem and a temple like its temple. This will be discussed later in its proper place. Antiochus was not satisfied with having taken the city unexpectedly, nor with the plunder, nor with the great slaughter he had carried out there. Instead, overcome by violent anger and remembering what he had endured during the siege, he forced the Jews to abandon the laws of their country, to leave their infants uncircumcised, and to sacrifice swine's flesh on the altar. They all resisted these orders, and the most honorable among them were put to death. Bacchides was also said to hold the fortresses. Since these wicked commands were joined to his own natural cruelty, he indulged in every kind of extreme wickedness. One by one, he tortured the worthiest of the inhabitants, and every day he threatened their city with open destruction, until at last the terrible excess of his crimes provoked the suffering people to take revenge. Accordingly, Matthias, the son of Asamanius, a priest who lived in a village called Modin, armed himself along with his own family, which included his 5 sons, and killed Bacchides with daggers. Then, because he feared the enemy's many garrisons, he fled into the mountains. So many of the people followed him there that he was encouraged to come down from the mountains and fight Antiochus's generals. He defeated them and drove them out of Judea. Through this success he came into power and became prince of his own people by their free consent. Afterward he died, leaving the government to Judas, his eldest son. Judas, believing that Antiochus would not remain quiet, gathered an army from among his own countrymen. He was the first to make a league of friendship with the Romans. When Epiphanes made a second expedition into the country, Judas drove him out by inflicting a great defeat on him there. Encouraged by the success, he attacked the garrison that was still in the city, for it had not yet been removed. He forced them out of the upper city and drove the soldiers into the lower part, which was called the citadel. Then he gained control of the temple, cleansed the whole place, built a wall around it, made new vessels for the sacred services, and brought them into the temple, because the former vessels had been profaned. He also built another altar and began offering sacrifices. When the city had already regained its sacred order, Antiochus died. His son Antiochus succeeded him in the kingdom, and also inherited his hatred of the Jews. This Antiochus gathered 50,000 foot soldiers, 5,000 horsemen, and 80 elephants, and marched through Judea into the mountainous region. He took Bethsura, a small city. But at a place called Bethzaccharis, where the pass was narrow, Judas met him with his army. Before the forces joined battle, Judas's brother Eleazar saw the tallest of the elephants, decorated with a large tower, and with golden military ornaments to protect the rider. Supposing that Antiochus himself was on it, Eleazar ran far ahead of his own army, and cut his way through the enemy troops until he reached the elephant. He could not reach the man who seemed to be the king, because the rider was so high above him. Still, he drove his weapon into the belly of the beast and brought it down upon himself, and he was crushed to death. He had done no more than attempt great things, and show that he preferred glory to life. The man who governed the elephant was only a private soldier. Even if he had proved to be Antiochus, Eleazar would have accomplished nothing more by this bold act than showing that he chose to die, when he had only a bare hope of doing something glorious. Indeed, this disappointment became an omen to his brother Judas of how the whole battle would end. It is true that the Jews fought bravely for a long time, but the king's forces were superior in number and had fortune on their side, so they won the victory. When many of Judas's men had been killed, he took the rest with him and fled to the toparchy of Gophena. Antiochus then went to Jerusalem and stayed there only a few days because he lacked provisions. So he departed, leaving behind a garrison that he thought sufficient to hold the place, while he drew off the rest of his army to take winter quarters in Syria. After the king had departed, Judas did not remain idle. Many men of his own nation came to him, and he also gathered together those who had escaped from the battle. Then he fought again against Antiochus's generals at a village called Edessa. He was too strong for his enemies in the battle and killed a great number of them, but at last he himself was killed as well. Not many days afterward, Antiochus's party laid a plot against Judas's brother John, and they killed him. When Jonathan, Judas's brother, succeeded him, he behaved with great caution in other matters concerning his own people, and he strengthened his authority by keeping his friendship with the Romans. He also made an alliance with Antiochus the son. Yet all this was not enough to keep him safe. The tyrant Trypho, who was guardian to Antiochus's son, plotted against him, and also tried to remove his friends. When Jonathan was going to Ptolemais to Antiochus with only a few people in his company, Trypho caught him by trickery, put him in chains, and then made an expedition against the Jews. But afterward Simon, Jonathan's brother, drove Trypho away. Enraged by this defeat, Trypho put Jonathan to death. Simon, however, managed public affairs courageously. He took Gazara, Joppa, and Janneus, cities near him. He also subdued the garrison and demolished the citadel. Later he assisted Antiochus against Trypho, whom Antiochus besieged in Dora before going on his expedition against the Medes. Yet Simon could not make the king ashamed of his ambition, even though he had helped him kill Trypho. Before long Antiochus sent his general Cindibius with an army to lay waste Judea and subdue Simon. Though Simon was now advanced in years, he carried on the war as if he were much younger. He sent his sons with a band of strong men against Antiochus, while he himself took part of the army and attacked from another direction. He also placed many men in ambush at many points in the mountains, and in every attack he gained the advantage. After winning in such a glorious manner, he was made high priest, and he freed the Jews from the rule of the Macedonians after 170 years of the empire of Seleucus. This Simon also became the victim of a plot. He was killed at a feast by his son-in-law Ptolemy, who put Simon's wife and 2 sons in prison, and sent men to kill John, who was also called Hyrcanus. But the young man was warned ahead of their coming, and hurried to the city, because he had great confidence in the people there, both because they remembered the glorious deeds of his father, and because they could not help hating Ptolemy's injustice. Ptolemy also tried to enter the city by another gate, but the people, who had just admitted Hyrcanus, drove him back. He immediately withdrew to one of the fortresses around Jericho, called Dagon. After Hyrcanus received the high priesthood, which his father had held before him, and offered sacrifice to God, he quickly set out to attack Ptolemy, so that he might rescue his mother and brothers. Hyrcanus laid siege to the fortress, and was superior to Ptolemy in other respects, but he was overcome by the rightful affection he had for his family. When Ptolemy was in distress, he brought out Hyrcanus's mother and brothers, set them on the wall, beat them with rods in everyone's sight, and threatened that unless Hyrcanus went away at once, he would throw them down head first. At this sight, Hyrcanus's pity and concern were stronger than his anger. But his mother was not dismayed, either by the blows she received or by the death she was threatened with. She stretched out her hands and begged her son not to be moved by the injuries she suffered in despairing that wretch, since it was better for her to die by Ptolemy's means than to live ever so long if he might be punished for the injuries he had done to their family. John's situation was this: when he considered his mother's courage and heard her plea, he began his attacks. But when he saw her beaten and torn apart by the lashes, he grew weak and was completely overcome by his affections. Because the siege was delayed in this way, the year of rest arrived, on which the Jews rest every 7th year just as they do every 7th day. In that year, therefore, Ptolemy was freed from the siege. He killed John's brothers and their mother, and then fled to Zeno, also called Catullus, who was tyrant of Philadelphia. Antiochus was now so angry over what he had suffered from Simon that he made an expedition into Judea, encamped before Jerusalem, and besieged Hyrcanus. But Hyrcanus opened the sepulchre of David, who had been the richest of all kings, and took from it about 3,000 talents in money. By promising 3,000 talents to Antiochus, he persuaded him to lift the siege. Moreover, Hyrcanus was the first of the Jews who had enough money to begin hiring foreign auxiliaries. At another time, however, Antiochus went on an expedition against the Medes, and thus gave Hyrcanus an opportunity to take revenge on him. Hyrcanus immediately attacked the cities of Syria, thinking, as turned out to be true, that he would find them empty of good troops. He took Medaba and Samia, along with the towns near them, and also Shechem and Gerizim. Besides these, he subdued the nation of the Cuthians, who lived around the temple built in imitation of the temple at Jerusalem. He also took many other cities of Idumea, including Adorian and Marissa. He then advanced as far as Samaria, where the city Sebes now stands, which was built by Herod the king. He surrounded Samaria completely with a wall and put his sons, Aristobulus and Antigonus, in charge of the siege. They pressed it so hard that famine prevailed within the city to such an extent that the inhabitants were forced to eat things that had never been considered food. The people of Samaria invited Antiochus, called Cyzicus, to come to their aid. He prepared himself and accepted their invitation, but Aristobulus and Antigonus defeated him. In fact, the brothers pursued him as far as Scythopolis, and he fled from them. They then returned to Samaria and shut the multitude inside the wall again. When they had taken the city, They demolished it and enslaved its inhabitants. Since they were still very successful in their undertakings, they did not let their zeal grow cold, but marched with an army as far as Scythopolis, made an incursion against it, and laid waste all the country within Mount Carmel. These successes of John and his sons made others envy them and caused a sedition in the country. Many people gathered together and would not remain quiet until they broke out into open war, but in that war they were defeated. So John lived the rest of his life very happily and administered the government in a most extraordinary way for 33 full years. He died leaving 5 sons behind him. He was certainly a very happy man, and gave fortune no occasion for any complaint against him. He alone possessed 3 of the most desirable things in the world: the government of his nation, the high priesthood, and the gift of prophecy. For the deity conversed with him, and he was not ignorant of anything that would happen afterward. He even foresaw and foretold that his 2 eldest sons would not continue to hold the government. It will be very worthy of our narration to describe their catastrophe, and how far inferior these men were to their father in good fortune. After their father died, the elder son, Aristobulus, changed the government into a kingdom. He was the first to place a diadem on his head, 471 years and 3 months after our people came down into this country, when they were freed from Babylonian slavery. Among his brothers, he seemed to have affection for Antigonus, who was next after him, and he made Antigonus his equal. But he bound the rest of his brothers, and put them in prison. He also put his mother in chains because she disputed the government with him, for John had left her in charge of public affairs. Aristobulus went so far in cruelty that he caused her to waste away and die in prison. But vengeance overtook him in the matter of his brother Antigonus, whom he loved and had made his partner in the kingdom. Aristobulus killed him because of slanders that wicked men around the palace invented against him. At first Aristobulus would not believe their reports, partly because of his affection for his brother and partly because he thought much of what they said came from the envy of those who told the stories. But once when Antigonus came from the army in splendid style to the festival at which, according to our ancient custom, we make tabernacles for God, Aristobulus happened to be sick. At the close of the feast, Antigonus came up with armed men around him, dressed in the finest possible manner, and in great measure he came to pray to God on behalf of his brother. At that very time, the wicked men came to the king and told him how pompously the armed men had arrived, and how insolently Antigonus had marched. They said this insolence was too great for a private person, and that he had come with a large band of men to kill him, because he could not bear merely to share royal honor when it was in his power to take the kingdom for himself. Little by little, and against his will, Aristobulus gave credit to these accusations. He took care not to reveal his suspicion openly, but he also made arrangements for security against any accident. Since he was lying sick in the place formerly called the Citadel, whose name was later changed to Antonia, he placed his bodyguards in a certain dark underground passage. He ordered them that if Antigonus came unarmed, they should let him alone, but if he came to him in armor, they should kill him. He also sent men ahead to tell Antigonus to come unarmed. On this occasion, however, the queen very cunningly arranged matters with those who were plotting Antigonus's ruin. She persuaded the messengers to conceal the king's message and instead tell Antigonus that his brother had heard he had obtained a very fine suit of armor, made with splendid military ornaments, in Galilee. They were to say that because his present illness kept him from coming to see all that finery himself, he very much wished to see Antigonus now in his armor, since in a little while Antigonus would be going away from him. As soon as Antigonus heard this, the good disposition of his brother kept him from suspecting any harm from him, so he came wearing his armor in order to show it to his brother. But as he was going along that dark passage called Strato's Tower, he was killed by the bodyguards. Thus he became a remarkable example of how slander destroys all goodwill and natural affection, and how none of our good affections are strong enough to resist envy forever. And truly, anyone would be surprised at Judas on this occasion. He belonged to the sect of the Essens, and he had never before failed or deceived people in his predictions. This man saw Antigonus as he was passing by the temple and cried out to his acquaintances, who were not few, for they attended him as his scholars. How strange! It is good for me to die now, since truth has died before me, and something I foretold has proved false. This Antigonus is alive today, though he ought to have died today. The place where he was destined to be killed was Strato's Tower, which is 600 furlongs from here, and yet 4 hours of this day have already passed. That point of time makes the prediction impossible to fulfill. After the old man said this, he became dejected in mind and remained so. But before long, news came that Antigonus had been killed in an underground place that was itself also called Strato's Tower, by the same name as that Caesarea which lay by the seaside. It was this ambiguity that had caused the prophet's distress. After this, Aristobulus repented of the great crime he had committed, and this caused his illness to worsen. He grew worse and worse, and his soul was constantly disturbed by thoughts of what he had done, until his very bowels were torn apart by the unbearable grief he suffered, and he vomited up a large quantity of blood. As one of the servants attending him carried that blood away, by some supernatural providence he slipped and fell in the very place where Antigonus had been killed. There he spilled some of the murderer's blood on the spots where the blood of the murdered man still showed. At this a pitiful cry rose among the spectators, as if the servant had spilled the blood there on purpose. When the king heard the cry, he asked what caused it. Since no one dared tell him, he pressed them all the more to explain what had happened. At last, when he threatened them and forced them to speak, they told him. Then he burst into tears, groaned, and said, "So I see that I am not likely to escape the all-seeing eye of God for the great crimes I have committed, and that vengeance for the blood of my kinsmen quickly pursues me. O most shameless body, how long will you hold a soul that ought to die because of the punishment it deserves for a mother and a brother slain? How long shall I spend my blood drop by drop? Let them take it all at once, and let their ghosts no longer be disappointed by a few small portions of my bowels offered to them." As soon as he had said these words, he died, after reigning no longer than a year. The king's wife now released the king's brothers and made Alexander king. He appeared to be older than the others and more moderate in temper. But when he came to power, he killed one of his brothers because that brother aimed at ruling for himself. The other brother he held in high esteem, since he loved a quiet life and did not meddle in public affairs. After this, Alexander fought a battle with Ptolemy called Lathyrus, who had taken the city of Successors. Alexander killed many of his enemies, but the victory leaned rather toward Ptolemy. When this Ptolemy was pursued by his mother Cleopatra and withdrew into Egypt, Alexander besieged Gadara and took it. He also took Amathus, the strongest of all the fortresses around Jordan, where the most precious possessions of Theodorus, the son of Zeno, were kept. Because of this, Theodorus marched against him, recovered what belonged to himself along with the king's baggage, and killed 10,000 of the Jews. Yet Alexander recovered from this blow, turned his forces toward the maritime region, and took Raphia and Gaza, along with Anthedon, which King Herod later called Agrippias. After Alexander had made slaves of the citizens of all these cities, the Jewish nation rose in insurrection against him during a festival, for seditions generally begin at those feasts. It seemed that he would not be able to escape the plot they had laid for him if his foreign auxiliaries, the Pisidians and Cilicians, had not helped him. As for the Syrians, he never admitted them among his mercenary troops because of their natural enmity against the Jewish nation. After he had killed more than 6,000 of the rebels, he made an incursion into Arabia. When he had taken that country, together with the Gileadites and Moabites, he ordered them to pay him tribute, and then returned to Areothus. Since Theodorus was surprised by Alexander's great success, Alexander took the fortress and demolished it. However, when Alexander fought with Obotus, king of the Arabians, who had laid an ambush and a plot for him near Golan, he lost his whole army. It was crowded together in a deep valley and broken to pieces by the multitude of camels. When Alexander escaped to Jerusalem, the greatness of the calamity he had suffered provoked the multitude, who already hated him, into an insurrection against him. Still, he proved too strong for them. In the several battles fought on both sides, he killed not fewer than 50,000 Jews over the course of 6 years. Yet he had no reason to rejoice in these victories, since he was only consuming his own kingdom. At last he stopped fighting and tried to come to terms with them by speaking with his subjects. But the changeableness and disorder of his conduct made them hate him still more. When he asked why they hated him so much, and what he should do to appease them, they answered that he should kill himself. They said that after the tragic things he had done to them, even when he was dead, it would be all they could do to be reconciled to him. At the same time they invited Demetrius, called Eucerus, to help them. He readily accepted their request, hoping for great advantages, and came with his army. The Jews joined those auxiliaries near Shechem. Alexander nevertheless went out to meet both these forces with 1,000 horsemen and 8,000 mercenary foot soldiers. He also had with him the part of the Jews that favored him, numbering 10,000. The opposing party had 3,000 horsemen and 14,000 foot soldiers. Before they joined battle, both kings made proclamations and tried to draw away each other's soldiers and make them revolt. Demetrius hoped to induce Alexander's mercenaries to desert him, while Alexander hoped to induce the Jews who were with Demetrius to desert him. His would not give up their rage, and the Greeks would not prove unfaithful, so they came to an engagement and fought closely with their weapons. In this battle Demetrius was the conqueror, although Alexander's mercenaries showed the greatest exploits both in courage and in bodily strength. Yet the outcome of the battle proved different from what either side expected. Those who had invited Demetrius to come did not remain firm to him, even though he was victorious, and 6,000 Jews, pitying the change in Alexander's condition after he fled to the mountains, came over to him. Demetrius could not bear this turn of affairs. Supposing that Alexander had already become a match for him again, and that the whole nation would at length run to him, he left the country and went away. The rest of the Jewish multitude, however, did not give up their quarrel with Alexander after the foreign auxiliaries had gone. They continued a constant war with him until he had killed the greater part of them and driven the rest into the city Berniceles. After he demolished that city, he carried the captives to Jerusalem. His rage grew so excessive that his cruelty advanced to impiety. He ordered 800 men to be hung on crosses in the middle of the city, and he had the throats of their wives and children cut before their eyes. He watched these executions while he was drinking and reclining with his concubines. This struck the people with such deep terror that 8,000 of his opponents fled out of all Judea the very next night, and their flight ended only with Alexander's death. At last, though late and with great difficulty, he gained quiet for his kingdom by these actions and stopped fighting any more. Yet Antiochus, also called Dionysius, again became a source of trouble. He was the brother of Demetrius and the last of the race of the Seleucidae. Alexander was afraid of him when he was marching against the Arabians, so he cut a deep trench between Antipatris, which was near the mountains, and the shores of Joppa. He also raised a high wall before the trench and built wooden towers, in order to prevent any sudden approaches. Still, he could not keep Antiochus out. Antiochus burned the towers, filled up the trenches, and marched on with his army. Since he considered revenge on Alexander for trying to stop him a matter of less importance, he marched directly against the Arabians. Their king withdrew into parts of the country best suited for fighting the enemy. Then, all at once, he turned back his horsemen, who numbered 10,000, and fell upon Antiochus's army while it was in disorder. A terrible battle followed. As long as Antiochus was alive, his troops fought it out, though the Arabians made a mighty slaughter among them. But when he fell, for he was in the forefront and in the greatest danger while rallying his troops, they all gave way. The greater part of his army was destroyed, either in the action or in the flight. As for the rest, who fled to the village of Cana, nearly all of them were consumed by lack of necessities, with only a few exceptions. About this time, the people of Damascus, because they hated Ptolemy the son of Menhens, invited Aretas to take the government and made him king of Celesyria. This man also made an expedition against Judea and defeated Alexander in battle, but afterward withdrew by mutual agreement. Alexander then took Pella and marched again to Gerasa, driven by a covetous desire for the possessions of Theodorus. After he built a triple wall around the garrison, he took the place by force. He also demolished Golan, Seleucia, and what was called the Valley of Antiochus. Besides these, he took the strong fortress of Gamala and stripped Demetrius, its governor, of what he had, because of the many crimes charged against him. Then he returned into Judea after spending 3 whole years on this expedition. The nation now received him kindly because of his success. When he was at rest from war, he fell into a sickness, for he was afflicted with a quartan ague. He thought that by exercising himself again in military affairs he would get rid of the illness, but by making expeditions at unsuitable times and forcing his body to endure greater hardships than it could bear, he brought himself to his end. He therefore died in the middle of his troubles, after reigning 27 years. Alexander left the kingdom to his wife Alexandra, trusting that the Jews would now very readily submit to her. She had been strongly opposed to the cruelty with which he had treated them, and she had resisted his violation of their laws. By this she had gained the goodwill of the people. He was not mistaken in this expectation. This woman kept the dominion because of the people's opinion of her piety. She chiefly studied the ancient customs of her country, and removed from the government those men who offended against their holy laws. Since she had 2 sons by Alexander, she made the elder, Hyrcanus, high priest because of his age, and also because his inactive temper in no way disposed him to disturb public affairs. He kept the younger, Aristobulus, with her as a private person because of the warmth of his temper. Pharisees now joined themselves to Alexandra to help her in the government. They are a certain sect of the Jews who appear more religious than others and seem to interpret the laws more accurately. Alexandra listened to them to an extraordinary degree, since she herself was a woman of great piety toward God. But these Pharisees gradually and artfully worked their way into her favor, and became the real administrators of public affairs. They banished and reduced whomever they pleased, they bound and released men at their pleasure, and to say it all at once, they enjoyed the royal authority, while the expenses and difficulties of it belonged to Alexandra. She was a sagacious woman in the management of great affairs, and was always intent on gathering soldiers together. She increased the army by 1/2 and obtained a great body of foreign troops, until her own nation became not only very powerful at home, but also terrible to foreign rulers, while she governed other people, and the Pharisees governed her. Accordingly, they themselves killed Diogenes, a man of rank and one who had been a friend of Alexander. They accused him of advising the king to crucify the 800 men mentioned before. They also prevailed on Alexandra to put to death the rest of those who had irritated Alexander against them. She was so superstitious that she complied with their desires, and so they killed whomever they pleased. But the chief men who were in danger fled to Aristobulus. He persuaded his mother to spare the men because of their dignity, but to expel them from the city, unless she believed they were innocent. So they were allowed to go unpunished and were scattered throughout the country. Alexandra sent her army to Damascus under the pretense that Ptolemy was continually oppressing that city, and she gained possession of it, for it made no considerable resistance. She also prevailed on Tigranes, king of Armenia, who lay with his troops around Ptolemais and was besieging Cleopatra, to go away by agreements and presents. Tigranes soon lifted the siege because of the domestic disorders that occurred when Lucullus made his expedition into Armenia. In the meantime, Alexandra fell sick. Aristobulus, her younger son, seized this opportunity, along with his household servants, of whom he had many, all his friends because of the warmth of their youth, and took possession of all the fortresses. He used the money he found in them to gather a number of mercenary soldiers, and made himself king. Besides this, when Hyrcanus complained to his mother, She pitied his case and put Aristobulus, his wife and sons, under restraint in Antonia, a fortress joined to the north part of the temple. As I have already said, it was formerly called the Citadel, but later received the name Antonia when Antony was lord of the East, just as the other cities, Sebast and Agrippias, had their names changed and were named after Sebastus and Agrippa. But Alexandra died before she could punish Aristobulus for disinheriting his brother, after she had reigned 9 years.
And there we will pause, with the Hasmonean kingdom at its height, but already turning its swords inward. Next time, in part 2, that family feud between two royal brothers tears the kingdom open and lets in Rome, as Pompey the Great marches up to the walls of Jerusalem. Mind the footnotes, and beware the folly.